Though the question be old, the currents press upon it again under new circumstances. What are reasonable limits to the freedoms of expression? Though in this piece we'll be focusing on the limits of speech-specific modes of freedoms of expression, there are cases to be made for applying such as discussed to other modes of expression, or not. A picture, to be blunt, isn't exactly the same as an issue of vocalization or written expression, but they are not entirely different either. Perhaps in a future piece we shall take the time to muse a bit on the other modalities of freedoms of expression. In the currents I find the modalities of speech to be of particular import. The main thrust on the various limits of free speech have to do with 1. Harm prevention. 2. Platform/reach responsibilities. 3. Level or unlevel playing fields. 4. Plausibly truth-seekingness. 5. Post-hoc pragmatics.
Harm prevention.
Harm prevention is among the most important, yet also the least controversial. If the speech involved is inciting violence of some sort, hate speech, etc., then it deserves to be curtailed in some manner or another. This point can be expanded upon, and there are some interesting conversations to have about it, but it is not exactly what I want to focus on here. I will say that as a matter of ethical concern, when we speak of curtailing such free speech, a fair amount of it will amount to limitations in access, reach, scope, and seriousness that anyone can or ought to take such speech. As opposed to folks actively not being allowed to literally speak of such things at all. In part such is accomplished by universal cultural condemnation, racism bad. Few are those who openly actively hold otherwise, though there may be disagreements as to what constitutes a racism. We might even hold that the overwhelming focus on racism bad in a cultural, not political context, may entail that there is a truth-seekingness aspect to it via the free speech, whereby the relevant disagreements as to what constitutes a racism are resolved. Insofar as someone does openly hold that racism not bad, or racism good, they ought be taken down in terms of folks laughing at them.
Platform/reach responsibilities.
Now, there is also non-cultural modes of curtailment that amount to legitimately not providing a megaphone for them. Deplatforming, or otherwise simply not providing a platform for them is a valid sort of thing, as it is consistent with the fundamental principles of free speech. Folks are not guaranteed the rights to use someone else's platform, in other words. Such would violate the rights of those people's freedom of speech in more or less the most egregious of ways, by forcing them to host or otherwise platform some form of speech that they themselves don't want. It is highly akin to forcing someone to say a certain thing they themselves refuse to say. It is perverse, and a fundamental misunderstanding, perhaps a deliberate misunderstanding, of the principles of free speech. Though it is very much worth noting that there are serious limitations to this sort of restriction of platforms. News coverage, for instance, may very well entail an obligation to give credible counterpoints and countervailing views regardless of any prescribed views or aims of the news organization. To not do so is for them to not be construed as news organizations, or providing news coverage at all. In which case they ought not be allowed to present themselves as news organizations. How exactly one enforces that matters. I'd suggest the courts are a realistic and pragmatic approach of such enforcement, e.g. if a news organization deserves the scare quotes, then they ought be taken to court for deliberately misleading the public. Insofar as there are laws in place already to enforce that, so be it. But there may need to be stricter punishments attached, as in a disbarment of a news organization from being allowed to practice as if they were a news organization. This is a kind of guarding against deliberate lies and misinformation on a meta-level, rather than within the weeds of it all. The suggestion here could be as light a touch as no pretesting to call oneself a news source, or news organization, but rather an after-the-fact kind of enforcement, which is not out of line with other sorts of goods and services. Medicine mislabeled is banned, snake oil salesmen are technically illegal, unsafe products are removed, and products that are not what they present themselves to be are likewise technically illegal already. Here the claim is to merely enforce them, and perhaps to make more strict the punishments, depending on what the current punishments are, with the aim of cleaning up the newsrooms, making clear what is news and what is just opinion, and not mixing these up. Such does also amount to restrictions on the use of the term news to describe a mode of expression. Other ways of looking at this are as they relate to types of platforms, and having a degree of honesty be applied to maintain the integrity of those platforms. A publication on fishing in whatever medium of media ought actually be about fishing. Such provides a broad venue to discuss the topics within, freedom of speech being curtailed by topic, without meaningfully curtailing expression within the topic itself. We focus, not wrongly, on news and academics in particular as they are particularly important platforms and modes of expression, but the principles that are applicable there are also applicable elsewhere. What kinds of speech are allowed, or ought to be promoted varies a great deal in regards to the platform and reach that the speech has. This point is rather more complicated than it may seem. Differing people have differing degrees of access to platforms, and perhaps more disturbing, it is generally, but not always, the case that those who have early access to the platforms will tend to hold on to them. This point dovetails with the level of the playfields, but deserves its own consideration as a matter of platforms.
Punching Nazis, the pros and cons.
Punching Nazis as a pro has of it the good of preventing the Nazi from becoming dangerous. It is in the Nazis' own interests to get punched, as if they become dangerous the response to them is far more deadly. A bloody nose to shut them down, instead of a bullet to end them. Now, folks are apt to hold something like, but that violence, and I agree. I am generally not pro-violence. But, that is a generally statement, there are exceptions. Among those exceptions are degrees of violence to prevent worse violence. Punching Nazis is a sport. It's a joyful sort of violence. It can be viewed as rather playful tbh. Recalling that folks actually oft enjoy play fighting. Certainly it is the case that folks might hear that and wonder what exactly is meant by play fighting. Well, without getting overly technical on the matter, play fighting is fighting whereby everyone walks away alive and without serious injuries. Punching Nazis, aside from the literal fist to the face, which I do endorse just to be clear, can include such things as being philosophically ruthless with them. Shouting them down. When a Nazi takes the stage at, a free speech rally, jeering them is appropriate. The notion that a space of prominence ought be reserved for Nazis such that they be able to speak without interruption, that is, such that their audience is expected to simply listen, is inappropriate. Note that there is a qualifier of importance to that statement, a space of prominence. The idea that free speech ought entail the capacity for Nazis to mobilize themselves, to gather, to recruit, etc., is altogether odd. Worse still though is the notion that when they do so, they ought not be punched in the face, literally and figuratively. It is, in other words, perhaps one thing to hold that in all pragmatics we can't go around policing speech in all venues by barring this or that kind of speech. Not positive that is the case, but it is certainly a plausible sort of view. All things considered, this will be touched upon more in a bit. But if the claim is that folks spouting off Nazi talk deserve to not face the consequences of what they say, well, that is merely a protectionist view of Nazism. We could hold to a variety of views that support free speech within that context. For instance, your free speech doesn't entail my lacking of free speech. So if you, the Nazi, is talking Nazi talking, I, not the Nazi, can certainly scream loud enough to shout you down. If speech is a rally, which perhaps it is, the same notion applies. A counter-rally to shout down the Nazis is exactly protected as speech. These are or ought be highly protected forms of freedoms of speech, that is, the right to shout someone down, the right to respond to the Nazi speech, and so forth. They ought be inculcated within spaces that provide for prominence of placement for speech. To be as clear as I can be on the matter, there ought not be any sense of freedom of speech whereby folks are protected from the freedom of speech of others. If folks are saying Nazis shit, part of the point of having freedom of speech is not to protect the Nazis, but to open them up to every single bit of criticism available. Anything less would be uncivilized.
The subtleties of the classroom.
This is where the point gets rather muddled. To be blunt about it, teaching a viewpoint is not necessarily the same as endorsing or holding a viewpoint. It can and indeed is valuable to, for instance, learn how to argue the various points of view that are already within the society. This regardless of what position one so happens to have, but ostensibly such is valuable for those who seek the truth, not necessarily because free speech produces truth. Looking at the internet's free speech jungle, hopefully everyone can be a bit more skeptical of that particular and particularly peculiar claim, but rather because it provides training to philosophically punch out the Nazis. A bit more broadly, and with increasing dubiousness as one does so, to philosophically knife the false, the untruth, etc. The focus, that is, on the truth of the matters at hand may exactly entail training in which one is taught the wrong, or unethical, sorts of arguments. So, again to be blunt about it, as a teacher it is very plausibly the case that to teach the Nazi views in class is an appropriate sort of thing to do, exactly so that the students can learn them and defeat them in the real world. In such circumstances one can teach the views of Nazism without actually endorsing them. And folks are practically bound to say something insipid like, "You don't mean teach, you mean present, or something else." Insipid wherefore? Because teach has the scare quotes and leads into the actual crux of the matter, namely, is merely the presentation of the Nazis actually a concern, as it presents the Nazis as a meaningful challenger? In other words, does the teaching method whereby the Nazi positions are taught entail a non-scare quoted teaching of Nazism after all is said and done? This I think gets towards the other end of the principle of freedom of speech as it relates to the Nazis. A systemic shutting down of the Nazis isn't the correct approach. As loathsome as their speech is, and it is utterly loathsome, even beyond the pragmatic implausibility of doing so, in the principle of the matter the Nazis ought be able to have their stuff presented. One cannot punch a Nazi if their face is hidden, and let's be clear, punching Nazis is the name of the game. A massive cultural push against racism requires that people have before them the Nazis that they ought be punching.
Where there may be problems with the principles of freedom of speech.
Insofar as the platforming of the Nazis entails a strengthening of their positions. On this I'd suggest a tactical point rather than a principled one. Platforming the Nazis in such a way that they fail is a good strategy.
Level or unlevel playing fields.
To whom does a platform go? This aspect is, I think, one that is at least somewhat new, but it does have a strong parallel within the free market system. Legacy problems within an economic system that privileged certain groups entails that even if there is an open playing field, it not being level entails that it is inherently unfair. The criticism is very valid, and is a serious problem regardless of any systemic discrimination. Simply having it be the case that someone's rises to the top, gains the goods and so forth entails that thereafter there isn't a level playing field. The second and subsequent iterations within an open playing field model are inherently at a disadvantage. See also the Moneyless Free Labor Society series, especially Part 1, the Contra Meritocracy subsection. Link in the description. In terms of free speech, whereby there is an open playing field, in especially the online forums, we still end up in a position whereby whomsoever so happened to be within the earlier iterations thereby comes to have a quite highly privileged position, one that isn't meritorious to the quality of the speech either. In short, open form structures fail to privilege meritoriousness, even in abstraction, and in the real world, it is far and away worse. Any of these systemizations require a dual aspect, rather specifically, an aristocratic aspect. An aspect that can step in and correct for the otherwise other than wise outcomes. Less poetically phrased, to correct for the non-meritorious privileging. This point runs counter and pretty strongly so to the principle of free speech, but it isn't in competition with it. It is a principle that acknowledges the limitations, the problems with any sort of open field model. Meritoriousness has to step in from time to time, to correct for the pretty much inevitable non-meritorious outcomes within such a modeling. In the context of racism, or bigotry, for instance, we can understand this kind of privileging of meritoriousness as the holding to the distinctly not free-form point that these are simply bad things. That principle is not derived via the free-form modeling, certainly not in the public, but rather, it is largely derived via the highbrow philosophical musing mutterings that occurs throughout the centuries, the very utmost of privileged positions. Within those systems, the privileging is of a fairly aristocratic disposition, based on such things as the pedigree and beauty of the claims. There are of course far and away more to it than that, But here I don't want to get into the internal methodologies whereby the academic aristocracies are determined. The point here more than anything else is that there are such principled pedigreed positions, such academic aristocratic disciplines that are not derivative of an open field, which can and do oft enough step in and make the kinds of corrections to an open field forum as is necessary. Such aristocracies are at least traditionally structured by way of truth-seekingness as a principal limitation of freedom of speech. In other words, among the principled limits of freedom of speech is exactly that it be truth-seeking.
Plausibly truth-seekingness.
As just alluded to, the traditional academic aristocracies are products of a principled position that deliberately limits the otherwise other-than-wise dispositions of freedom of speech. This notion deeply calls into question many of the insipid positions regarding freedom of speech which hold that somehow or another unfettered freedom of speech simply produces truth. I want to take the most naive position I can on this, and hold that truth is that concept of that towards which we ought seek out. In this sense we can skew ourselves, and skewer certain others, from notions of truth-seekingness that already abuse themselves by way of pop concepts as to what that is or may be. Here I am going to rely on other works of mine, such as The Odd Questions of Privilege, A Slight History of Colonialism, and A Comprehensive Guide to All of Human History so as to make certain points that I think would otherwise be difficult to make here. Truth is an undifferentiated ought. It is not necessarily fact or factual. It may or may not be useful. Such pragmatisms we shall approach shortly though. The truth-seekingness functional relation is encompassing of those things we might term as fictitious, or stories, and they may not be of moral or ethical worth. These sorts of oughts are pre-ethical in their formal structure. As noted in A Comprehensive Guide to All of Human History, a kiss has no meaning to it, but it sure does add beauty to the world. It is an ought without ethics. There is nothing ethical or unethical about a kiss. It serves no purpose on its own. But as a matter of living, life, and the reality, a kiss adds to the overall structure. It becomes a thing with which folks can make beauty, wildness, strangeness, horrors, pain, and love. In that sense it is an undifferentiated ought. Which is what truth-seekingness aims for primarily, and secondarily, though not necessarily less importantly, just after the fact of the primarily ought, truth-seekingness makes real the specifications of the undifferentiated ought. It comes to carry an ethic as a matter of tried and true methods, and towards which we might very well hold a similar, related but different ought, that of the good. Now, that is likely some heady shit. This relates though to freedom of speech well, as the undifferentiated ought does have a requirement of freedom of speech for it to obtain at all. We might call such the primary aspect of truth-seekingness. The kiss must be made for any of the secondary aspects of truth-seekingness to obtain. But once so made, that kiss and its interpretations become differentiations of the heretofore undifferentiated ought. Those secondary truth-seekingness aspects of freedom of speech are for most folks at any rate the mainstay points of freedom of speech. These entail the aimings within the freedom of speech towards this or that. Let's call such the
Hoc Pragmatics.
These amount to the tactful tackings toward some aim. To keep our tack tight in this musing, racism bad is a fine example of such truth-seeking tacts. We posit racism bad as a muse, a derivative of the primary undifferentiated ought truth, couple perhaps we may muse with the good as another relevant undifferentiated ought, and we thereby cut away at what would otherwise be a freedom of speech free for all based on the specific aim of curtailing speech insofar as it falls afoul the racism bad premise. We are not prejudging what might constitute a racism bad, we are merely positing that if something does run afoul such a premise, we thereby may hold that it ought not. That sort of freedom of speech is valuable, pragmatically so. Terms of service, discussion moderation, classroom discipline, limitations of podiums of prominence, and tactical platforming just with the aim of the justice to cut them down are all plausibly fine derivatives of this.